Well, thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. And we appreciate Sandy bringing dessert for us. And always good to be with you all. We look forward to these. Our series is intended to take a little bit of time to consider some very important books and to look at them from a Christian point of view. We are doing a two-part series this month. We're looking at reflections on the revolution in France. And then next month, a companion class will be looking at A Tale of Two Cities. And the two, of course, fit very well together. Tonight, our teacher is Jordan Tidwell, and I will turn it over to Jordan.
No relation. So I can get situated here. Thank you for the warm welcome, Clay, and everybody. So this is a work that most of us are probably not familiar with to start out with. If you are not familiar with political history, if you're not familiar with this particular time period, the revolution being referenced, obviously the French Revolution of the 1790s, you probably have not heard of this particular work, or if you've heard of it, you've probably not read it. That shouldn't hold you back at all from tonight and from getting the argument from the author, Edmund Burke, out of it, what he would want you to get out of it, and to figure out exactly what he was thinking. Before we dig in, let's start with a little kind of thought experiment to get moving. So let's start with two children on a playground. And this is just the saddest playground I've ever seen. If you Google 1890s playground, that's the first picture that comes up. So I don't know what was happening back then, but they were not having a great time. So let's imagine two children on the playground, and they come to a disagreement, and they are not able to reconcile themselves to each other. One child throws the other one like under the jungle gym or something and says, "You can't leave until I have my way. We disagree, and now it's my way or you're stuck here." And that would obviously, none of us, Nicole's a teacher, she would intervene if she was in charge of I don't know if you do playground stuff, but if you are in any kind of authority position here, you would intervene. You would say, "This is wrong. This is not how people should behave to each other." All right, let's fast forward with these same individuals, let's say 20 years later, and they have grown up. One of them is now a police officer, and the other individual is now some sort of miscreant doing all kinds of bad things. And the police officer thinks he sees the other individual take someone's wallet out of their pocket. Then this individual, same two people, 20 years apart, they go up and he says, "Okay, I saw what you did. Now I'm going to take you away and put you in prison." So again, the exact same idea. You were formerly free to do what you want. Now I'm restricting your freedom and making you abide by my will. This example, though, is very different. With this example, not only are these individuals older, one of them is acting as an agent of the state. One of them is a police officer. And we're okay with this. If we saw this happening, we wouldn't freak out. If you see somebody being put in the back of a car, you're very, very upset, unless it's a police officer who is in the process of arresting someone. And then you say, "This is okay." Or, barring any kind of weird circumstance, you say, "This is okay. This is how things should proceed." What is different? What's different is legitimacy. The idea is that there are certain actions that are legitimate, certain actions that are not legitimate. Things proceed in a certain way, and they're okay, and they're accepted, and they're a means by which society can function. If you act outside of this, you end up with arbitrary action. So with the children, this is an arbitrary action. My preference, your preference, two children fighting. With the example of them as grown adults, one of them acting on behalf of the state. So let's dig into this question a little bit and keep this example in the back of your mind as we go through tonight. How does this happen? How are we okay with individuals, taking these actions, and we say this is legitimate and it is part of our society? So our author tonight is Edmund Burke. You might have heard his name even if you don't know any of his works, and that's okay. I would encourage you after tonight, maybe just glance through some of his writings. I would say, and I'll get back to this at the very end, but it can be very dry to read political literature if it's not someone that you're very interested in, but his language is very, very powerful, and definitely someone that if you're interested in becoming a better writer and someone with a better command over the English language, he is someone who is a great example. And even if you just leaf through to take a couple examples, you'll probably come away with it with a better understanding. He is still heavily quoted. If you see, there are many quotes which are misattributed to him, but he is a very quotable and very quoted individual even today. Now, he is born in 1729 in Ireland, and his status as a maybe Irish Catholic would kind of dog him his whole life because the Catholics were not so well liked in England during this time. And we'll get to that in just a second, and we won't spend too much time there, but it is an interesting thing to keep in mind. So he didn't live too much longer after the start of the French Revolution. This is the last decade of his life when he really becomes incredibly prominent with the writing that we're about to discuss, Reflections on the Revolution in France. So he was sort of a journeyman politician. And if I was to say a good parallel to him today would be someone who is like an internet blogger who is just kind of produces big name hits from time to time. So if there's a particular name that you look for, and you're like, oh, I'm just skimming like the New York Times opinion section, and then this guy has something, and I'm really excited to see what he has to say. That would be more like what Burke was before Reflections on the Revolution in France. Very widely read and widely regarded, but not like he was never prime minister. He was never anyone who was going to be remembered for all of history before this work. So his initial pieces that he wrote were about what he called the sublime. And his version of the sublime is, why are certain things beautiful? So why is it that if we take a field trip out to the backyard of the church and we look in the little ravine where there is kind of a little sewage ditch, we might say, well, I guess it's a river, I guess it's a creek, but it's not beautiful, and it's certainly not sublime. But then if we get in the car and we drive and we find like a big waterfall, we would say, well, this is striking and it's beautiful. Why is that? How do we quantify what is beauty? And so he was very interested in that from his youth, and as he grew and became more widely read, he continued to write about that. So that idea of touching something beyond yourself is very important to his work, and it's very much a part of him. We can contrast this with Judges. If you want to turn to that verse, if you have your Bible on your phone, or if you just want to kind of glance through as we continue. This verse here, again, think about the individuals who see the face of God or in the presence of God, being in the fear of the Lord and understanding that his presence is awesome in the most literal sense of the word, where you are compelled to experience awe, is sublime beauty in its most supreme sense. And so again, you see sort of the religious nature of Burke from this immediately. Someone who is motivated intensely by his religious faith, which we'll get to in a little bit. But again, the application of religious faith and making it something that you can examine in day-to-day life. So again, let's look at Burke in 1790, when the French Revolution really begins in earnest and when things start to fall apart. We are not going to go through too much of the history of the French Revolution in this class. We do not have time. That would turn this into a week-long lecture series, and we do not have time for any of that. So if you are not familiar, I would really encourage you to take a look at those events. Again, glance through it, find a quick timeline, and make sure you're a little bit familiar with it if you want to dig into this work. It's not really required, but Burke makes so much more sense if you understand what he's talking about. He's talking about events as they unfold and before most of them have happened. That's very critical. We'll get to that in just a few minutes. So by this point, Burke's career looks like it's almost fizzled out. Formerly, he was paymaster of the forces. This is kind of like, I don't know, like auditor of the state, something like that would be our modern equivalent. At this time, it's a very prestigious office, and he did a pretty good job, but he made a lot of enemies. He was tasked with investigating British corruption in India. At this time, the British East India Company was still around, and they were running the country almost as a private fiefdom. And so there were, of course, numerous cases that he had to prosecute. He made a ton of enemies. He took a hard line against others at home, and so he had enemies abroad and at home, and he didn't really have the political capital to make too much of it. So he ended up kind of fizzling out, and he seemed to be coasting on his way to retirement at this time. So what happened? What happened is that a family friend wrote to Burke and said, hey, the revolution in France, we're watching it unfold across the channel. I want to know what you think of it. Surely you think it's a good thing, right? And we'll get to why he would have told him that in just a second. But he expected Burke to just write him back something quick and say, yes, I agree. This is something that we'll keep our eye on. I'm excited. And Burke did not write something quick. He wrote a book, and it was published as a pamphlet, which became a huge success, not as big as like the other works that I mentioned here, but it definitely reignited interest in Burke and sort of a late stage renaissance in his career. Now, Thomas Paine, someone you're more familiar with, wrote Rights of Man as a reaction against Burke, and that initially had a much wider audience. Burke was sort of the flash with Reflections on the Revolution in France, and Thomas Paine was the explosion with Rights of Man. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote Vindication of the Rights of Man almost directly as an invective against Burke. She kind of hated his approach, and a lot of her work is personal attacks against him. Neither of these age very well. We'll get into this in just a minute, but Burke was prescient in his predictions about the revolution. And whenever he starts to be proven right over and over and over and over again, interest in his other works falls off. Thomas Paine would, of course, be imprisoned in France, and his story kind of gets a tough turn there. But Burke is vindicated. So something that we'll look at in just a second. So what did Burke believe? Now, Burke was usually credited as the founder of modern conservatism. And what does conservatism mean? That's kind of the question for the entire time tonight. So even if you say, well, I don't think of myself as very conservative, I still think that this is very much important to consider, because if you're considering what you're not, you should still really, I think about why that is and examine how you've arrived at your own conclusion. So if you're going to say, I am rejecting this view of the world, I still think examining Burke and examining the roots of his argument are important. So if you look at Proverbs 22:6 and 29:15, both of those verses raise up children in the way they should go. Looking at the way that we raise our children in the church, I think that explains almost in a very easy capsule what conservatism is. And Burke would use similar religious language, and we'll get into that in just a bit. But what Burke succeeded is making conservatism an everyday concern. And so it is not something that is wholly academic and wholly removed and only discussed in an ivory tower, but it's real. Conservatism is, I have children, I have beliefs, I want my beliefs to be transmitted to them. I have a country, I'm interested in it functioning normally, I like things going roughly the way they are, and if they're going to change, I want it to be considered well. So I want people to be steady hands throughout that whole process. So that is really his success, is that he makes it approachable, he makes it something tangible that you can touch and not wholly academic. Burke is, again, still at this time near the end of his career, and even all the way to today, still very much an important historical figure. Again, you might have heard of his name, even if you have not read this work. Interestingly enough, after a little bit after his time, after his prime time, I guess, King George III was a fan of Burke and thought that he was a really well-thought politician. Of course, other royalists would have thought much the same way, and we'll get into that in just a second. But even later prime ministers, Churchill and Gladstone, both really liked Burke. On the other end of the spectrum, he is still attacked by people who have a problem with his view of the world. In Das Kapital, there's a sub-note in there where Karl Marx just calls Burke the sycophant, and says that he is someone who is propping up the world as it was, and the kind of person that Marx, of course, is interested in destroying to bring about a new world. And we'll get to that in just a little bit, why the revolutionary impulse is opposed to what Burke was standing for. So with the French Revolution, now we actually get into his text, and I'll read the quote above here. It says, we know that we have made no discoveries, and we think that no discoveries are to be made in morality, nor many in the great principles of government, nor in the ideas of liberty, which were understood long before we were born. So what Burke is saying is that if you stumble onto something like human morality, if you stumble onto something like philosophy, and you say, I am right, those before me are wrong, you'd better be absolutely sure, and chances are you're wrong. If I look at thousands of years of human history and I say the way you've all been doing this is wrong, and in fact I am right, then again you're making a very, very, very heavy claim. So again, Burke in his time, and why I said that people thought that he might have been sympathetic to the French Revolution, is because he had a reputation as a more progressive-minded, liberal-minded individual of the Whig Party, and we'll get into what that means in just a second with the word Whig there, not one that we use today. So he was sympathetic to the Catholic minority. The Catholics were a small minority in England, not so in Ireland, obviously, but in England they were, and he was sympathetic to them, thought they should be treated better. He was sympathetic to the subjects in British India. He said, if we are going to be an imperial power, we need to take care of our people, and we need to treat them as subjects, eventually citizens, and we need to be on the same page. And it looks bad for us when we don't do that, and we're not holding up our end of the bargain. So he was more progressive on that. He was again, concerned about the situation with the American colonists, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But he was sympathetic. He never supported the American Revolution outright, and we'll talk about that in just one second. But he was, again, sympathetic to those. And then finally, he published one of the earliest arguments against the Atlantic slave trade and kind of formulated a means by which the slave trade could be worked out of existence and laws could be brought about to eventually remove it from the British public system. So he never set that into motion. By the time he formulated that argument, his political power was pretty much non-existent, but he still published it and endorsed it. And so again, this is way before anybody else was on that same page, even in England, and certainly not in the Americas. So he is ahead of his time. And again, we look at this and we say, well, that's a pretty progressive-minded, forward-thinking guy. So everyone was surprised when he came out as hard as he did against the French Revolution. So before we do that, we're going to understand what laid the foundations for Burke's thinking. And this takes us to three revolutions. One, the British Civil War, the English Civil War, and the Glorious Revolution. And don't worry, we'll cover that in just one second. Second, the American Revolution, and finally, the French Revolution. So looking first, the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. Burke answers the questions because those in France would say, well, we're having our revolution. The Americans just had theirs. And then you in Britain just had a revolution, about a century ago. How is this different? How can you three or you two revolt and change things to suit yourselves, and then we can't? So I am just going to go out on a limb and assume that people are not as familiar with the Glorious Revolution. So we're going to do a quick speed run here. King Charles I is an isolated, kind of unpopular Catholic monarch in a Protestant country. He already kind of unpopular, but raises taxes without the consent of Parliament, similar to why we were upset in the American Revolution. The parliamentarists, I guess we call them, find a voice and a unified leader in Oliver Cromwell, who raises a new model army is what he calls it, a force that is trained to rebel against the king and depose him. King Charles I is executed. And that's, kind of a famous occurrence. You might already know a little bit about that. Cromwell runs the country for, I think, about 10, 15 years, almost as a military dictator. Kind of a spooky guy. He kind of definitely goes off towards the crazy end, towards the later stages of his career, but eventually he dies. So now England is left in a pickle. Well, we got rid of our king, and now the guy who was leading us instead of the king, almost as a king, is now dead. So we've got nobody left. So they go back to the king's family and they invite his son back, who becomes Charles II. And I say, well, let's try this again. Charles II is not a great king, but everybody likes him because he's really personable and outgoing. He fathers, I believe, 12 to 15 illegitimate children, but 0 legitimate children, which is a problem. So the throne then goes to his half brother, I think full brother, James II. James II is who we're going to look at for just one moment here, because he is incredibly unpopular without the personality of his brother, and also unskilled in government. And again, just like his father, attempts to circumvent Parliament. If you're not familiar, Parliament is like similar to our Congress. So decision making is being taken away. At this point, the Parliament elects to bring in a new king. They go to the Netherlands and they contract one of his cousins, King William III, and they invite him to come in and be king. It's called the Glorious Revolution, but there's no battles fought in England proper. Whenever the king arrives, William is a soldier. He's been preparing for war his whole life. He's immensely popular. As soon as he lands in England, James II flees and abdicates. So this is where we get these two words. You might be familiar with the words Whigs and Tories. Whigs are those who support Parliament and William. Tories more support the monarchy, kind of James, but not really. So Burke is definitely a Whig. He likes Parliament. He likes the parliamentary procedure. He likes voting on things. He likes the choice. So again, why does that not sound like the revolution? The people are choosing this. So why is Burke against it? In terms of reflecting on the Glorious Revolution, here, Burke sums up his idea. The very idea of the fabrication of a new government is enough to fill us with disgust and horror. We wish at the period of the revolution, and do now wish, to derive all we possess as an inheritance from our forefathers. So again, the idea that with something of this importance, you want something that has been transmitted to you from those before you. If it is important enough to exist for thousands of years and you're going to depart from it, you better have a very, very good reason, and you better know what you're doing. Another example, again, I believe we are going to look at the book of Judges. If you remember, Gideon's son Abimelech created a conspiracy to almost rule over Israel and take control himself using his personal charisma. Again, like we just talked about, he was hoping to split up the loyalty that was felt to Gideon's family and install himself as the lone ruler in Israel. Now, the example that we see here in the warning about Abimelech in Judges 9:7-15 talks about picking someone that you like for the immediacy, for the now, at the expense of forever. And so the example there is whenever you pick the flawed king, in the example in Judges, it's electing a thorn bush to rule over you. Okay, maybe it's attractive and maybe you want somebody for whatever reason, but once you're in the thorn bush, you're in it and it is your reality. So again, picking something for the now to at the expense of before and after is not a good decision. Now is fleeting, forever is forever. And so again, very important there. But the American Revolution, we are much more familiar with that. I hope we all remember our middle school, high school civics classes. If not, we can do a refresher on that some other time. So Burke was never really in favor of the American Revolution, but he was more or less quiet. He said, this is maybe his most well-known quote regarding it. When you drive him hard, and him being the Americans, when you drive him hard, the boar will surely turn upon the hunters. If English sovereignty and their freedom cannot be reconciled, which will they take? And this is the exact same way that a lot of the American colonists were feeling. All right, we either pick our freedom and our dignity or being British subjects. I'm picking my freedom and my dignity. They will cast your sovereignty into your face. Nobody will be argued into slavery. So again, here you're dealing with reality versus the imperfectness of government. This is an entirely different discussion than what we're really getting into tonight. But again, Burke is not someone who is reflexively, I hate change all the time, always. He is a realist in this way. He says, this is what's happening, and I wish they wouldn't have done it, but now they've done it, and I'm okay with it. So he argues for reconciliation in the American sense. So what makes the French Revolution so different? What is happening in France at this time that causes him to sound the alarm bells and tell people, I'm freaking out about this, and honestly, I think you should be too. So again, the dates there, 1789 versus 1799, 1789, really the earliest rumblings, the calling of the Estates General. Remember, in the earliest couple of years, this is not really how the French Revolution looked. It was not a bloodbath. It was not a mess. At first, the Estates General, which is their version of Parliament or Congress, was in control. And people were voting on it. People were proceeding. The people in charge were still in charge, but something was different. So what is it? I thought this is a really interesting quote from Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese revolutionary. Someone asked him, what was the fallout and the historical significance of the French Revolution in his time? So again, he would have been 1950s, 1960s. And at that point, he still said, I think it's too early to tell what the full scope of this is. This is truly one of the most important world history events that's happened in recent history, in the past 200, 300 years. So what is different? Now, the difference is that the French have started to pull up things that go well beyond politics, things that go well beyond your day-to-day life and into reality itself. Again, go all the way back to our example at the beginning with the policeman. A policeman pulls you over and you say, even if I don't agree with him, he says I was speeding, I am not. You still respect the idea of the rule of law. If you want to change everything, you start to, again, have to reforge reality itself from the beginning. Two verses that I think are very important to understand this concept. If you look at 1 Timothy 6:20, look at the admonition to Timothy to guard the deposit that's been entrusted to you. The deposit, again, something that existed before you were, that your job is to keep it safe. Your job is to conserve it, we might say, in the Burkean language. Your job is to protect it and transmit it to those who are coming after you. Think about the parable of those who are given talents. If you spend it, waste it, throw it away, bury it, and forget about it, you aren't doing your job. You have to take care of it. And then again, the empty deceit of worldly philosophy in Colossians 2:6-8. What happens when people look at things which have been come before and been well established and say, I can do better. I've got this. And now again, if you think of this as another example from something that a child might do, if you think of like we play the game Jenga, where they're blocks stacked up and they make a tower and it looks very secure. And then when you start pulling things out of the bottom and setting them up on top to make new things, well, I'm building something new, but what are you using as the building materials? You're pulling things out of the bottom. What happens in Jenga? It falls over. It falls over eventually, unless you're really, really, really good. And that's just it. That's Burke's argument. You're not that good. It's going to fall over. So again, something is different here. Now, the intellectual class leading the French Revolution, one of Burke's really pithy good quotes is he says, in terms of feeding people bread, I'd like to ask bakers, not professors, in terms of how we should do that, something like that. And so the problem with an intellectual class is once people start to see themselves as these sort of shepherds, and especially the Enlightenment thought that was dominating the world, but really France at this time, as people stop seeing themselves like this. I'm a parliamentarian, and they see themselves like this. I am this ascended person who can see past what's clouding your vision, and now I will lead you and I will teach you in a way that you can't. So whenever you have that vision of yourself, you've lost any sort of self-moderation, self-control. You now think of yourself as someone who can do it. If we're talking about, flipping the Jenga table over, the Jenga tower over, you think that you are the one. So again, think about the hubris to look at thousands of years of human history and say, actually, I think I know quite a bit better than you. So again, something is definitely going wrong in the French Revolution and in French society. Now, this is where Burke is proven absolutely right, because most of us who are familiar with the French Revolution know that the wheels came off about 1794, 1795, and with the terror, things really start to come unhinged. So let's return to our two children. These both are, let's say they've gone home, and I don't know, maybe they're their brothers now, and they live together. Now, they are in the kitchen, and the kitchen, again, a complicated task with high stakes. If you do something wrong in the kitchen, you could burn the whole house down. Now, let's say that these two children want to get involved. They see their mother working in there and they say, well, we want to help. They start turning knobs on the stove and they start doing things that they shouldn't be doing. There's really no other option other than, we might say, like corporal punishment. You have to kind of smack them and say, get out of the kitchen, or shoo, get out of the kitchen. You can't teach them how to cook in that, split second interaction. You can't take the time to, develop them and make them mature, responsible adults in that second. You have to shoo them out of the kitchen. So that same desire to, hold on, let me just get control of the situation, let me make sure that things are at least proceeding safe, you want to shoo someone out. From the other end of this, extended metaphor, if you're the child, I'm just trying to help. Let me just try and help. And as you turn dials and as you do things in the kitchen, you're making it worse and worse and worse until eventually things spiral out of control. So again, with both ends of this, you imagine yourself as a child, imagine yourself as the mother, you're just doing what you think you have to, but you're either, making your children sad, which that's maybe the least bad outcome in this situation, or you are literally burning the house down. And you say, well, I was just trying to help. Again, we look at the individuals here. I'm just trying to help. I'm just trying to lead you. I'm just trying to give you new ideas. Well, yes, you are, and your help is not helping. So with the Reign of Terror, that is something that, of course, makes for fascinating reading. But instead of just being sort of like rubbernecking and awking at the bloodshed and saying, wow, I'm glad that's not us, let's keep going. Let's look at why people actually endorsed this sort of thinking. So let's return to Burke for a second. He says the worst of these politics of revolution is this: they temper and harden the breast in order to prepare it for the desperate strokes which are sometimes used in extreme occasions. He's saying that once you start pulling out those Jenga blocks and once you start upheaving things, you end up living in a world where there is nothing left that's sacred. I'm okay with executing my own king, then what's left? What else is there to hold you back? If you think that you're just trying to fix the country and you've already killed your king, your hands are already bloodied and there's nothing left to hold you back and you're committed now. And so what sort of things do these people do? If you look up the drownings of Nantes, if you look up the different prescription lists, the people who died in the French Revolution, sometimes it's overplayed, but it's a horrible time to be alive. And this is not just people who are living in their ivory towers. This is not just nobility who is killed. These are normal people who are just trying to mind their own business. And again, that's another very important lesson here, I think, is whenever you say, this is all political, I'm not into politics. Whenever politics knocks on your door and says, we are here to arrest you, that's not an answer. You cannot say, oh, that's really not for me. So again, worth keeping an eye on here, just to see, this is how people around me act, and this is how people around me think. So I'm going to keep my eyes on it. The utilitarian system is something that I want to mention just for a second. This is a school of thought that would have come around after Burke, but it's the sanitized view of the world where you have a very dispassionate, non-loving, non-charitable view of everyone around you. So Burke has a quote underneath here. He says, by hating vices too much, they learn to love men too little. He's talking about the revolutionaries there, but he's also really talking about the lack of love in any sort of worldview like this, where you start to view the world as sort of a spreadsheet that only you can balance. And you forget that these aren't numbers, these aren't drawings, these aren't abstracts, these are real people. Every one of us is a person just the same, and we deserve the same respect and the same love and dignity that we would afford to anyone else. And again, I will come back to this at the end, but that's a very Christian message, and I think makes us uniquely situated to understand and appreciate Burke, that everybody has this innate worth, everybody has a soul. So of course that means there's still governance that has to be done, but done with a soul, not whatever you end up doing whenever you try to assume control. Now,
Burke correctly predicted the terror. In his writing against 1790, well before the terror, he predicted that. But when he really became recognized as prescient and very skilled in his predictions is when he predicted not only the terror, but what came after it. Is he said almost word for word, in the weakness of one kind of authority. So as things spiral out of control, the country is no longer being run by people who know what they're doing. And in the fluctuation of all, again, craziness every day, the officers of an army will remain for some time mutinous and full of action until some popular general shall draw the eyes of all men upon himself. It was this right here. Napoleon, everybody knows who Napoleon is, very good. So the idea there, this is written in 1790. Nobody knew who Napoleon was in 1790. He was some artillery colonel who wasn't internationally famous at all. Burke almost had a time machine here. And this makes him very famous. Again, people who formerly preferred the arguments of Paine and Wollstonecraft are now turning to Burke. And again, by this point, he is no longer alive for much of the Napoleonic Wars, but he is, again, prescient. He understood that this was coming. So how do we look at this? There's no Napoleon in our country, or is there? There's no easy parallel, or is there? We look at, with the modern parallel, people want safety and control. People want to feel like they are going to be taken care of. We're having an academic discussion. We're having a discussion here. But in terms of, I want to go and be safe. I want to know that the money in my wallet is worth something. I want to go to a bank and wherever they say, we're insured. I want that to mean something. People want society to work. So there is a tolerance for this revolutionary thought, this bleeding edge political theory. There's a tolerance for it until it runs up into the solid wall of reality. And when that happens, again, first the terror, things become very dangerous because people are lashing out. And then again, the authority. We have a Napoleon figure who says, I will fix things, and people are willing to do whatever it takes to let that person fix things for them, which becomes very dangerous. The modern phenomenon is something called the adults in the room view. And you think of this, I think this phrase became really popular with the 2008 financial panic, when it turns out that a lot of people who said, we're the adults in the room, we know what we're doing, it becomes very evident that they actually have no idea what they're doing. It turns out that they actually, have the degrees, they have the certifications, but they're just people like you and me, and they actually are not to be trusted, maybe with the level of expertise that we expect of them. So again, that's all abandoned when you run into someone like Napoleon. If you look at the image, again, people almost worshiping him, grasping at his feet, proclaiming him victorious. And again, he remained that charismatic center in these people's lives until even whenever he was in exile, there were still people who were wholly devoted to him. And again,
his tomb looks great.
It does, and it's still there. So again, if you go to Napoleon's tomb today, again, someone who died in exile alone, it still looks like the tomb of an emperor, of a king. People don't let go of this easily once they've latched on to somebody else. So we looked at the mess. Now let's look at Burke's option. He says, okay, this is something that I don't want. You start trying to pull apart the Jenga pile and you end up with a mess on the floor. So what do we do? There's something else. So here, let's return to Burke one last time. When ancient opinions and rules of life are taken away, the loss cannot possibly be estimated. From that moment, we have no compass to govern us, nor can we know distinctly to what port we steer. So tradition, the idea that there is something that exists before you that is to be valued, and that you are considered successful if you preserve it. And if it has to be changed, you do so slowly and with consideration. You don't do it to please yourself. You don't do it to satisfy the now at the expense of the future, because the future 5 minutes from now will arrive. It is coming. And whenever it arrives, the now is the past. The past is constantly growing, the future constantly shrinking, and the now is passing through. So again, keep an open mind, keep a cool head, and proceed. Now, and speaking of keeping cool heads, one of Burke's, let's say, less flattering, but very beautiful illustrations is he talks about the English people being like a herd of cattle in a field. And they are listening to all the noisy grasshoppers and people trying to incite them and people trying to bother them and steer them off the path. And they just, bat their big cow eyes and continue grazing and continue moving on, all the while sheltered by the massive solid oak tree of English governance. Now, obviously, that's a little bit silly. We would hope that we would not be large cows, but there is something in that where these individuals, these cows, are not easily swayed. They are not easily moved. They have their purpose. Their purpose is to sit and graze. Now, we have a much higher purpose than that, but they are not going to be startled by any old grasshopper. So a good example, and I think ties right back into where we are, Acts 17:11. If you look at the Bereans, whenever the Bereans receive instruction, they don't freak out. They don't drop everything. They go back into scripture and they examine it and they know what is true. In just the same way, I would hope that we do the same. Whenever you receive news, you process the world around you, you hear scary things, you hear things that, are new thoughts. You don't jump both feet in, no brakes, all gas, let's go, because that's how you crash. You end up going back to things that are important, things that are scriptural, things that are good to take seriously, and you review them and you take them and give them that their due. So that, in my brief summary here, is really the essence of what Burke's conservatism looks like. Not saying that there's no change, not saying that you have to be a sedated cow, but that you have to be slow to react, not out of sloth, but out of careful consideration and understanding that when you act, it is taking ownership and authority. And if you don't know what you're doing, the results can be devastating. So a couple thoughts here. There's a fun political cartoon. Burke was an intensely religious person, and this takes it into you guys can't really see. I'll get up closer. So this is a caricature of him. He apparently had a big nose, but this is obviously a political cartoon. He has a cross and a crown, and he has the reflections of the revolution there is printed above him. And the man here who's writing his paper says on the benefits of atheism and anarchy. And so obviously this is like the stereotyped super hardline revolutionary, and Burke is like sniffing him out to tell him about why he's wrong. And then the beheading of King Charles I on the wall behind him there of the revolutionary. So this is a little bit extreme, but Burke was deeply religious and understanding. Again, there are things that are not to be touched because they are too important for me to alter them. They go beyond my self-importance and they are eternally important. Again, that worldview fits in very nicely with a religious worldview. Now, Burke's religious views, we don't have time for that tonight, but again, whenever we're talking about things that you need to take seriously, I think that religion is the prime example. Our politics can change, our political situation can change. We could be having this exact same class anywhere in the world, and our political reality could be whatever. But scripture goes way beyond that. All of us will have to make an account. All of us have to explain why we've lived a certain way and endorsed certain beliefs. And that's, the ultimate end of it. So obviously something to keep in mind. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. If you are not into political reading, Burke is not going to be your thing. I would still really let you know that it is worth your time to leaf through it. If you find one of his essays, if you even want to just Google like Edmund Burke quotes and find some of these long form quotes that you enjoy, he is a very quotable and very skilled writer. And again, even without reflections on the revolution in France, he would have been regarded as such, but this is his masterpiece. So I recommend it. But if this is not your speed, some other works that kind of get to the same argument. And I think if you take Burkean thought into these other works, you end up kind of maybe seeing things that you might have missed before. The first two that sort of are in the same theme, Lord of the Flies, usually recommended reading for us in high school if you have gone through that. If you missed it, I would recommend revisiting it. And its counterpart that I have here, Animal Farm. Both of these works are about individuals who are trying to rebuild society. In Animal Farm, it's specifically about the Soviet system. And of course, as the title suggests, it is about animals on a farm. And they are trying to restructure society in a way that they view to be superior. We want to fix things. And again, the pigs who are the literal pigs who are trying to reorganize the farm are the ones pulling the Jenga blocks out. And it becomes very abundantly clear that not only are they corrupt, they also don't know what they're doing. And the fallout is pretty intense. With Lord of the Flies, young boys crash land on an island after a plane crash, and they have to try to reorganize themselves, elect a leader, and almost rebuild society. And it's, again, they think they know what society is because they think they remember, well, this is how mom and dad talk to each other. This is how they interacted with each other. And it turns out it's much, much, much harder to make yourself heard and understood and communicate than it seems. With 1984 and Brave New World, we've already talked about this in our schematics class earlier, but both of these books show what happens to society whenever they lose sight of that mission, that Burkean mission of what came before. what's coming after. In 1984, it's all surrendered to control. I want to control everybody and tell them exactly what to live and how to be, because I want a certain result right now. In Brave New World, it's not about governance, it's about me. I want to experience certain things. I want to be entertained at all time. What came before doesn't matter. What's coming after doesn't matter. It's about right now and me being entertained at all times for always. So those kind of mirror images there. And honestly, Jurassic Park at the end, I thought it was very interesting. The book really hammers this argument more, but the movie too. If you just don't even like reading, turn on Jurassic Park and think about it with a Burkean perspective. The entire movie, for those of you who are not familiar with the cinematic masterpiece that is Jurassic Park, the first one that came out in 1993, is about a park of cloned dinosaurs that is having a safety inspection and things go wrong. There's sabotage. And it's impossible to regain control once control has been lost. So you have an individual who attempted to institute control over a system he didn't understand. And whenever things started to come apart, it only becomes more and more and more and more dangerous to even remain there at the system. So again, if reading isn't your speed, turn on Jurassic Park and think about it from a Burkean perspective, which I'm sure no one has ever told you to do before. So as we wrap up, let's take a look at some discussion questions. If there is any discussion or anyone has any questions, we don't have to linger on these. If you want me to circle back to anything else, or if all your questions have been answered, you know everything that you would about Burke, that's fine. But something to guide our thoughts as we close up. So first of all, is religious belief itself inherently conservative? And please separate this from the understanding of the left-right political divide, what it means to be a conservative. I think let's go back to the Burkean definition. Is it inherently conservative in that I have beliefs, they are in the Bible. If I find myself in opposition to them, then I am incorrect. If I feel one way, the Bible is another way, I am wrong. That means there is something outside of me that is eternal. The Bible which my parents believe, the Bible which hopefully my children believe, is the same Bible. I am merely a conduit. I am passing through. It is eternal. Is that conservative? Obviously, I'm going to answer yes. If you feel differently, though, that's definitely a discussion worth having. Is this something that we want to conserve? And if there is progress and progressiveness, we could say, to be made, or liberal attitudes, then what is the place? If there is the inherent conservation mindset to Scripture itself. Again, the same could be true of any system which you don't want to change. So again, if you're running a company and you're making money and everything's going great, and you say, well, I don't really want to take any radical changes, do anything radically different, then you could be a conservative. If you have a car that you really like and you don't want to get a new car, you're conservative about your car. It can be very small opinions. It doesn't have to be something enormous. You know, you can be conservative about a shirt that you like to wear. You know, I don't want to change. So if you don't want to change, or you feel like you can't change, there need to be good reasons for it, maybe, and that could be a conservative attitude. So examine that. Why is that? Okay, next, the role of moderate, careful, and continuous reform in political social life. What does that look like? So we've said that, you know, we don't want to be Molotov throwing revolutionaries. We don't want to be crawling all over things and burning it to the ground. Okay, fair enough. Burke says, good job. So then how do things change? Again, Burke was not, you know, locked in a room, padded walls, nothing changes ever. I'm not allowed to change anything. He was on what at the time would have been a very progressive edge of moderate reform, of intelligent continual renewal and reform. So how can we strike that balance? If there are things that need to be adjusted, how do you do that intelligently and with a sober mind? Okay, now none of us are members of Congress. So what does it look like in a day-to-day life? What does that look like in our spiritual lives? And what is the place for that if there is there? Again, we just said Scripture doesn't change, you know, so hopefully we should go to it. But then does that sort of outlook mirror itself in a religious life? That's a huge discussion, maybe not for tonight, but something to think about. Okay, finally, this is a little bit different here. In a group setting, how do you feel differently about expressing yourself, I should say expressing yourself, about sensitive topics such as those that we just talked about, governance, life, society, even the concepts of eternity, in terms of religion, the sanctity of life, etc. Very important topics. We talk about it here in one way, and then we go to our workplace and it's a different way. Think about, if we go back to the terror, things come unhinged, things fall apart, and the mob mentality and the group mentality makes people different than they truly are. If you take any of those people, set them down alone, they'll be a different person than the type of person that was pushing along the terror. So how do people change in a group? So self-censoring. How do you interact with the world? And then ask yourself, would I have gone along with the terror? If I was there and I was just going along to get along, what happens if you're going along to get along in a very bad place in a very bad time? You might find yourself doing very bad things. So obviously we hope not. So then if we're going to say, well, no, that wouldn't be me, let's say, okay, why? Let's prove it. Let's do the legwork and actually find out how can we be conservative in a way that is still useful and helpful. So thank you all very much for being here tonight. Again, if there is discussion, I'd be glad to circle back on anything. But other than that, that's really it for tonight. Oh yeah, Bill.
Elise says she would have, she didn't really say this, but she thinks our American Revolution was absolutely wrong. We should have been loyal to the king. So what would you say? And what would Burke say?
Oh, okay. So if we said, so Burke obviously would have, again, he did not write about the American Revolution as much, more or less went silent on it after a certain date, but he would have said, again, he did advocate for a process of reconcile. So the idea that, okay, the revolution happened, now we need to get over it and come back. Again, what makes the American Revolution different is that we, I guess, opted out of a monarchy. We have changed things more than Burke would have been comfortable with. I'm sure that he would have preferred that we remain in the British system, but he was sympathetic to the American claims. Now, with the French Revolution, it is pulling apart all sorts of different things and going far beyond. So again, with the American Revolution, if you've ever, is it Rip Van Winkle is the guy who falls asleep? So in the original story of Rip Van Winkle, he falls asleep before the American Revolution and wakes up afterwards, and things are different, and that's why he's kind of startled. But again, it's still the same world. The worldly values are still the same. Whereas if you look at the image that I used here, this is a painting of the celebration of the cult of the supreme being. The church was being expunged in France at this time, and this is what they came up with to replace it with. That's a mess. That's psychotic. The idea that we want to manufacture something and cram it down your throat and say, this is your new traditional faith. So this is going far, 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 far beyond what Burke would have been comfortable with. You're pulling up even the pavement as you're trying to drive on top of it, and you end up, obviously crashing a car if you do that. So I think he was not like a revolutionary in the American Revolution. He was not thrilled about what we did, I would say, but he understood it and he advocated for reconciliation shortly thereafter.
Is it true that they replaced wearing crosses with wearing little guillotines?
I'm not sure. With the French Revolution, there's about 1 million stories like that, and it's hard to verify because again, everyone was so shocked. But that sort of thing, again, even addressing each other as Monsieur, Mademoiselle, everything became citizen, and you find that with revolutionary societies all over. In the Soviet Union, it's not Mr., Mrs., it's citizen or whatever, comrade, whatever you have there. So again, pulling up even the very fabric of how you talk to people. Interesting. Great, Tristan.
Yeah, a couple things. The picture of the man on top of the mountain, feeling that he is so high and mighty.
Yes.
We just talked this morning in the Tuesday morning class about humility, and it's just obviously is in a total different direction.
Yes,
and we see that sometimes in our culture. Someone that they wouldn't even contemplate the idea of maybe not looking at it right or maybe being wrong. And we just have to. We have to be people of humility. Then the other thing I thought of when you were talking about when you related it to businesses, and this is just it's not silly, but it may not relate to some of you. But when I was growing up, there was a place called Rack's Roast Beef. I think there's still one in Circleville or Chillicothe, but the business went under, and it was because they pulled up the foundation of what made them great. They stopped just doing roast beef sandwiches. And they started doing pizza and hamburgers. They tried, they just uprooted their foundation and died. And then I think in contrast to that, Cane's, there could be something that causes Cane's to change. If we find out there's some illegal drug that makes us want it in their sauce or something, they might have to change something, but they stick to what they're good at. And at least, in this immediate past, they've done a good job.
I actually had Cane's for lunch today. So
Very good.
very tough.
Would you say that,
Clearly your friends.
that in essence, the main problem that ended up having with the French Revolution, a lot of it was not just the fact that they were seeming to overthrow the government, but it was literally almost a change of cultural morals. That there was a
Entirely,
moral
yeah.
upkeep that was
Entirely.
happening in a massive way, which is one of the key things that tied to his religious belief, that
Yes.
they were overthrowing the very concept of what it meant to even believe, to even to hold to anything of great value. They were literally going, anything of old, we're replacing with something new.
Yes. And so, and that's the sort of thing where whenever you read Burke, it is tough because, at the time, the French society was based prior to the revolution on the Catholic Church and on the ancient regime, the king. Now, we don't really like either of them. I don't want to be ruled by the Catholic Church. I don't want to be ruled by a king. So it's tough to feel that same, affection and a desire to see it continue, even whenever you are opposing the revolutionary mindset. But that's where his argument almost outlives himself. And so look beyond Burke and look at his argument. It's not about the Catholic Church. It's about, do you want to be throwing the Molotov or do you want to be more level-headed? Yeah.
Something that was interesting is he was much more upset with the mistreatment of the Queen than the mistreatment of the king. And that's probably the most famous section in the whole book.
And the quote, chivalry is dead.
Yes, the age of chivalry is dead. And he goes on, to talk about the calculators, philosophers have succeeded. And he said, and the glory of Europe is gone forever.
Based off of what I was saying just a second ago, would you also then, the US Revolution, basically with that, would his lack of being against it in some ways be founded on the fact that they weren't looking to upheave basically all the moral aspects? In fact, it was just the monarchy they were throwing off. Not
Yes, and so
necessarily
that's again, a political exchange is fine. Not always fine, but it is on the table and it is something that you can do. All of us could go out and vote for something tomorrow, but if we all go out and go to a different church and go to and wear different uniforms and act all crazy, it's not overthrowing the government, it's overthrowing your life. You're pulling up what makes you you. Again, go all the way back to the assumption with the policeman. Think about every single line of thought that has to fire in succession for you to be okay with that. I have to be okay with the state. I have to be okay with the laws. I have to be okay with, well, I was driving too fast and now for the common good, I've got to speed. There are different assumptions. And if you uproot all of that to serve whatever purpose, you're dealing with a huge fallout. Was there anything else or is that everybody? All right, perfect. Well, thank you all so much. And again, if there's anything else, I'd be delighted to stick around. But otherwise, I'd encourage you to pick something from the list and maybe take a look, the reading list there. Or if you want to dive into Burke, again, it can be tough. Any sort of political pamphlet is not something that you just read lightly to relax, unless you're really into the topic, in which case, good for you. But again, take a look at some of his writings, get a sense of how he wrote, who he was, and I think it'll definitely be enriching for you. Thanks again so much, and everybody has a good night.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.